Everyone mocked the old scope until her bullet stopped artillery 2 miles out. Margaret Sullivan wiped the dust from her weathered hands as she walked through the Army surplus store. At 68 years old, she moved with the careful steps of someone who had seen too many battles, both on foreign soil and in her own heart. The other customers barely glanced at the elderly woman browsing through the military equipment section. "Looking for something special, ma'am?" asked Jake, the young store clerk, his tone polite but dismissive. Margaret had been coming to this store for months, always examining the same section, always asking about the same items, "Just browsing," Margaret replied, her fingers tracing the cold metal of an old sniper scope mounted on a dusty shelf. The scope looked ancient compared to the sleek modern equipment surrounding it. Its brass fittings had turned green with age, and several small dents marked its surface. Jake shook his head slightly. Other customers often whispered about the crazy old lady, who spent hours staring at outdated military gear. They didn't know that Margaret had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a sniper. They didn't know she held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill shot in her unit. They saw only an aging woman with gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt. "That old thing's been here for 2 years, Jake mentioned, hoping to move the conversation along. "Nobody wants it." "The new digital scopes are so much better." Margaret nodded but didn't move away. She knew the scope's history better than anyone in the store. It was a vintage Unertal, the same model she had trained with during her early military days. The craftsmanship was superior to many modern alternatives, but younger shooters preferred electronics over mechanical precision. A group of young soldiers entered the store, their voices loud and confident. They wore their uniforms with pride, fresh from basic training. Margaret watched them examine the newest rifle accessories, their conversations filled with technical jargon about laser sights and computerized targeting systems. "Check out Grandma over there," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Probably thinks she knows something about shooting." His friends chuckled, glancing at Margaret with amused expressions. Margaret had heard worse comments throughout her life. After leaving the military, she had tried to share her knowledge by volunteering at shooting ranges and offering to train new recruits. Most dismissed her expertise, assuming an older woman couldn't possibly understand modern warfare or precision shooting. The store manager, Mr. Peterson, approached Margaret with a forced smile. "Mrs. Sullivan, you've been looking at that scope for months. Maybe it's time to consider something more practical." "What makes you think it's not practical?" Margaret asked calmly. Peterson gestured toward the digital displays nearby. "Well, these new models have computer assistance, automatic wind compensation, range-finding capabilities. That old scope requires manual calculations for everything." "Manual calculations," Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose it does." The young soldiers had moved closer, pretending to examine nearby items while listening to the conversation. Margaret could feel their skeptical stares, the same look she had endured countless times when people discovered her military background. "I served too, you know," one of the soldiers said suddenly. "Iraq 2 deployments. What branch were you in, if you don't mind me asking?" "Army," Margaret replied simply. "Sniper unit, Afghanistan." The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly doubtful. Female snipers were rare enough, but a woman Margaret's age claiming such experience seemed impossible to their young minds. "Really?" another soldier asked. "What was your longest shot?" Margaret paused, considering whether to answer. She had learned that sharing specific details often led to more skepticism, not less. "Far enough," she said finally. The soldiers smirked among themselves. Jake rolled his eyes behind the counter. Even Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, as if Margaret was telling elaborate stories to gain attention. "Look, ma'am," the first soldier said condescendingly. "No disrespect, but modern warfare is pretty different from whatever you might have experienced. Technology changes everything." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. Technology has changed many things." She picked up the old scope, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. "But some fundamentals remain the same." "Like what?" the soldier challenged. "Patience," Margaret said, setting the scope back down. "Understanding wind patterns, calculating distance without computers, knowing your equipment well enough to make impossible shots when the technology fails." The group fell silent for a moment, unsure how to respond to her quiet confidence. Margaret had no intention of proving herself to strangers in a store, but something in their dismissive attitudes reminded her of younger soldiers she had trained years ago. "Well," Peterson interjected awkwardly, "if you're not planning to purchase anything today, maybe we should let these gentlemen browse in peace." Margaret smiled politely. "Of course. I'll be back tomorrow, same time." As she walked toward the exit, she heard one of the soldiers mutter, "Crazy old bird thinks she's some kind of war hero." Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She had spent years trying to prove herself to people who refused to listen. Maybe it was time to stop trying. Maybe it was time to let her actions speak instead of her words. The brass bells above the door chimed softly as Margaret stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Behind her, the soldiers continued their shopping, already forgetting the strange encounter with the elderly woman who claimed to be a sniper. Margaret walked slowly toward her pickup truck, her mind already working through plans she had been considering for weeks. Tomorrow's weather forecast called for clear skies and minimal wind, perfect conditions for what she had in mind. She glanced back at the store one final time. Through the window, she could see the old scope still sitting on its dusty shelf, waiting patiently for someone who understood its true value. Margaret smiled to herself as she drove home. Some people needed to see proof before they would believe. Tomorrow she would provide exactly that kind of proof. Margaret's farmhouse sat on 300 acres of rolling hills, 30 miles outside town. She had purchased the property after retiring from the military, seeking the solitude that only rural life could provide. The house was modest, but the land offered something precious, complete privacy and natural shooting ranges that stretched for miles. In her basement workshop, Margaret maintained a collection of rifles that would impress any serious marksman. Each weapon was meticulously cleaned and calibrated, stored in custom cases she had built herself. But tonight she focused on one particular rifle that had been her companion through countless missions overseas. The Remington 700 had been modified extensively during her military service. Its barrel was custom machined for maximum accuracy, the stock fitted perfectly to her measurements, and the trigger adjusted to her exact specifications. It was an extension of her body, as familiar as her own heartbeat. Margaret spent 2 hours preparing her equipment, checking every component with the methodical precision that had kept her alive in combat zones. She loaded her own ammunition, each cartridge crafted to exacting standards with hand-selected bullets and carefully measured powder charges. The next morning arrived with the predicted clear skies. Margaret drove to the surplus store earlier than usual, arriving just as Jake was opening the shop. She waited patiently for other customers to arrive, particularly the young soldiers who had questioned her credibility the day before. "Back again, Mrs. Sullivan?" Peterson asked as she entered. "Still interested in that old scope?" "More interested than ever," Margaret replied. "In fact, I'd like to make a proposition." Jake looked up from his inventory checklist, curious about the unusual request. Margaret had never attempted to negotiate or make special deals during her previous visits. "What kind of proposition?" Peterson asked cautiously. "I'd like to borrow that scope for a demonstration. If I can prove its effectiveness, I'll purchase it at full price. If not, I'll never bother you about it again." Peterson frowned. "What kind of demonstration?" Before Margaret could answer, the familiar group of young soldiers entered the store. They nodded politely to Peterson but barely acknowledged Margaret's presence. "Perfect timing," Margaret said quietly. "Gentlemen, would you be interested in settling yesterday's discussion about modern versus traditional equipment?" The soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. The tallest one, who seemed to be their informal leader, stepped forward. "What do you mean?" "A practical demonstration," Margaret explained. "Your modern equipment against that old scope you all found so amusing yesterday." The soldiers looked intrigued despite their skepticism. "What kind of demonstration?" the leader asked. "Target shooting. Long distance. You choose the range and targets." Jake laughed nervously. "Ma'am, we can't just let customers take equipment out for test runs. There are liability issues, insurance problems." "I'll take full responsibility," Margaret said calmly, "and I'll pay double the scope's price if I can't outperform your modern equipment at whatever challenge you set." The soldiers whispered among themselves, clearly tempted by the unusual bet. Peterson looked uncertain but intrigued by the potential sale. "Where would we do this?" the leader asked finally. "My property," Margaret replied. "Private land, completely safe with natural ranges up to 3 miles." 3 miles? One of the younger soldiers scoffed. Lady, even military snipers rarely shoot beyond 2 miles effectively. Margaret smiled. Then 2 miles should be perfectly reasonable for today's test. The group spent several minutes discussing logistics and safety concerns. Margaret waited patiently, knowing that young soldiers could rarely resist a challenge, especially one they believed they would easily win. "All right," the leader said finally, "but we set the conditions. Our equipment against yours, same target, same distance. Whoever gets more hits wins." "Agreed," Margaret said. "Mr. Peterson, may I borrow the scope under these conditions?" Peterson hesitated, then nodded slowly. The potential sale and the entertainment value of watching the old woman fail seemed worth the minor risk. An hour later, the group had assembled at Margaret's property. The soldiers had brought their personal rifles, each equipped with expensive digital scopes and modern accessories. Their weapons represented thousands of dollars in cutting-edge technology. Margaret's setup appeared primitive by comparison. The vintage scope mounted on her military surplus rifle looked like a museum piece next to their gleaming equipment. "You sure about this, ma'am?" the leader asked one final time. No shame in backing out. Margaret was lying prone behind her rifle, studying the distant targets they had established at exactly 1 mile. "I'm sure," she said simply. The soldiers had chosen challenging targets, steel plates 18 inches in diameter, barely visible to the naked eye at such distances. Modern scopes would provide clear magnification and computerized corrections for wind and distance. "Ladies first," one of the soldiers said mockingly. Margaret ignored the comment, focusing entirely on her rifle and the distant target. Through the old scope, she could see the steel plate clearly despite the equipment's age. More importantly, she could read the subtle signs that electronic systems often missed. The way grass moved to indicate wind patterns, the heat shimmer that revealed atmospheric conditions, the tiny environmental details that determined the difference between hits and misses at extreme range. She made minute adjustments to her scope's mechanical dials, calculations based on decades of experience and knowledge that no computer could replicate. The soldiers watched impatiently, clearly expecting her to miss badly and end the demonstration quickly. Margaret controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate through techniques learned in combat zones around the world. Her finger found the familiar curve of the trigger, applying pressure with the same steady precision she had used to eliminate enemy threats from impossible distances. The rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder. A second later, the distant clang of metal confirmed what Margaret already knew. Direct hit. The soldiers fell silent, staring through binoculars at the target that now showed a clear bullet hole in its center. "Lucky shot," one of them muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret simply worked her rifle's bolt, chambering another round. "Your turn, gentlemen." The first soldier positioned himself behind his rifle with confident movements. His weapon featured a state-of-the-art digital scope with built-in range-finding capabilities and automatic wind compensation. The technology represented everything modern military science could offer. He spent several minutes adjusting electronic settings, consulting digital readouts, and fine-tuning computerized calculations. The scope's display showed precise measurements for distance, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. Everything appeared perfect according to his high-tech equipment. The shot rang out across the valley. Through binoculars, they watched dust kick up several feet to the left of the target. "A clean miss, equipment malfunction," he muttered, checking his electronic systems. "Give me another shot." Margaret remained silent as the soldier made additional adjustments. His second attempt struck closer to the target but still missed by more than a foot. Frustration crept into his voice as he blamed wind calculations and atmospheric interference. The second soldier took his position with equal confidence but similar results. His expensive scope provided detailed data readouts, but somehow the information wasn't translating into accurate shots. 2 attempts, 2 misses. By the time the fourth soldier had failed to hit the target, their earlier cockiness had disappeared completely. They had collectively fired 8 rounds at a target that the elderly woman had hit on her first attempt, using equipment they had dismissed as obsolete. "Something's wrong with the atmospheric conditions," one of them said defensively. "The computer calculations aren't accounting for something." Margaret quietly fired her second shot, another perfect hit striking within inches of her first bullet hole. "How?" the leader asked, his skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. "What are you seeing that our equipment isn't reading?" Margaret pointed toward a grove of trees halfway to the target. See how those leaves are moving? Your computers are measuring wind speed at ground level, but the wind patterns change at different elevations. That grove creates a wind shadow that affects bullet trajectory. She indicated a patch of different colored grass near the target area. That section has higher moisture content, which creates temperature variations that cause air density changes. Your digital scopes calculate average atmospheric conditions, but shooting at extreme range requires understanding microclimate variations. The soldiers listened intently as Margaret explained environmental factors their sophisticated equipment couldn't measure. She described techniques for reading terrain features, understanding how sunlight affected air currents, and recognizing subtle visual cues that indicated atmospheric disturbances. But how do you calculate all those variables without computers? One asked. Experience, Margaret replied simply. Thousands of hours studying how bullets behave in different conditions. Learning to trust your observations over electronic readouts. She fired a third shot, this time calling her adjustment aloud before pulling the trigger. 2 clicks right for the wind shift. 1 click up for the rising thermal current from that south-facing slope. The bullet struck exactly where she had predicted. The demonstration continued for another hour. Margaret successfully hit targets at distances ranging from 1 mile to nearly 2 miles, using the same old scope the soldiers had mocked. Meanwhile, their modern equipment produced inconsistent results, occasionally hitting targets at shorter ranges but failing completely at longer distances. I don't understand, one of the younger soldiers admitted. Your equipment is ancient, but you're shooting better than our best marksmen. Margaret began cleaning her rifle with practiced efficiency. Your equipment is excellent for most situations, but it's designed to make shooting easier, not to make shooters better. When you rely entirely on computers, you stop learning to read the environment yourself. She held up the vintage scope, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. This scope forces you to understand every factor that affects your shot. You can't just plug in numbers and expect perfect results. You have to become part of the shooting system yourself. Jake, who had remained quiet throughout the demonstration, finally spoke up. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do, Margaret smiled graciously. No apology necessary. You had no reason to believe an old woman could outshoot trained soldiers with modern equipment. But you're not just any old woman, the leader said with newfound respect. You're clearly something special. What unit did you serve with? Margaret hesitated, then decided the young man had earned an honest answer. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Sniper Section. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. The soldiers fell silent. The 75th Ranger Regiment was legendary among military personnel, known for accepting only the most elite soldiers. Female rangers were extraordinarily rare, and female ranger snipers were almost mythical. What was your longest confirmed kill? The leader asked quietly. Margaret secured her rifle in its case before answering. 2 miles, 1,400 yards. Taliban commander directing mortar fire against a forward operating base. Single shot, confirmed kill. The number sent ripples of disbelief through the group. Even among military snipers, such distances were considered nearly impossible. That's a world record class shot, one soldier whispered. It was necessary, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. The conventional approach would have required calling in artillery or air support, which would have taken too long. American soldiers were dying while we waited for backup. She looked at each young soldier individually. That's why I prefer manual equipment over electronic systems. In combat, technology fails. Batteries die. Computers malfunction. Electronics get damaged. But mechanical systems keep working as long as you understand how to use them properly. The group packed their equipment in thoughtful silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by respect and genuine curiosity about Margaret's military experience. As they prepared to leave, the leader approached Margaret privately. Ma'am, would you consider teaching us what you know? Not just about shooting, but about reading environmental conditions the way you do? Margaret considered the request carefully. She had tried to share her knowledge before, usually meeting resistance and skepticism, but these young soldiers had just experienced first-hand proof that traditional skills still had value in modern warfare. Come back next weekend, she said finally. Bring notebooks and dress for field conditions. Real training doesn't happen on comfortable shooting ranges. Word of Margaret's demonstration spread quickly through local military communities. By the following weekend, 12 soldiers had gathered at her property, including the original group plus several of their friends who refused to believe the stories they'd heard. Margaret had spent the week preparing comprehensive training materials, drawing from decades of combat experience and teaching methods she had developed during her military service. She understood that these young soldiers represented a new generation that had grown dependent on technology, but still needed fundamental marksmanship skills. "Before we touch any rifles," Margaret announced to the assembled group, "we're going to spend 3 hours learning to read the environment with our eyes and minds, not electronic instruments." Several soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly expecting immediate hands-on shooting practice. Margaret ignored their impatience, leading them to an elevated observation point overlooking her property's natural shooting ranges. "Tell me what you see," she instructed, pointing toward the distant valley. "Trees, grass, hills," one soldier replied impatiently. "Can we start shooting now?" Margaret smiled patiently. "Look closer. What's the wind doing in that grove of oak trees compared to the pine stand beside it? How is the grass moving differently in the sunny areas versus the shaded sections?" For the next hour, Margaret taught them to observe minute environmental details they had never noticed before. She explained how different types of vegetation indicated soil moisture levels, which affected local temperature and air density. She showed them how to read wind patterns by watching grass movement, smoke drift, and the way dust particles moved through sunbeams. "Modern scopes give you numbers," Margaret explained, "but numbers don't tell the whole story. A computer might say the wind speed is 8 miles per hour from the west, but what if there's a thermal updraft from that south-facing slope? What if there's a temperature inversion creating air density changes at different elevations?" Gradually, the soldiers began to understand the complexity of factors affecting long-range shooting. Their electronic equipment could measure some variables, but Margaret was teaching them to perceive dozens of additional influences that no computer could detect. When they finally began shooting practice, Margaret insisted on starting at relatively short distances with iron sights only. No scopes, no electronic aids, just fundamental marksmanship principles. "But we already know how to shoot," one soldier protested. "We qualified as marksmen with our units." Qualifying at 300 yards on a controlled range is different from engaging targets at unknown distances in field conditions, Margaret replied firmly. "Strip away your technological aids and show me what you actually know." The results were humbling. Without their familiar electronic scopes and range-finding equipment, several soldiers struggled to hit targets at distances they normally handled easily. They had become so dependent on computerized assistance that their fundamental skills had atrophied. Margaret patiently worked with each soldier individually, correcting stance, breathing techniques, trigger control, and sight alignment. She taught them to estimate distances using terrain features and human anatomy references, rather than electronic rangefinders. "Your equipment should enhance your skills, not replace them," she emphasized repeatedly. "If you can't make accurate shots with basic equipment, adding electronics just makes you a more expensive target." By the third weekend, word of Margaret's training sessions had reached professional circles. A group of law enforcement snipers requested permission to observe her methods, followed by private military contractors and competitive marksmen. Margaret's reputation evolved from crazy old woman to legendary instructor within local shooting communities. The surplus store owner, Peterson, began referring customers to her for advanced training, and Jake started treating her with the respect due a genuine expert. But Margaret's most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Major Sarah Chen, a current military sniper instructor, arrived unannounced one Saturday morning with official credentials and genuine curiosity about the training methods everyone was discussing. "I've heard remarkable things about your program," Major Chen said professionally. "Would you mind demonstrating your techniques for evaluation purposes?" Margaret recognized the careful language of official military assessment. Someone in the chain of command was taking notice of her work, possibly for formal recognition or integration into existing training programs. "Of course," Margaret replied. "What would you like to see?" Major Chen had brought her own rifle and equipment, including the most advanced sniper scope currently used by military forces. Her credentials were impressive. She was responsible for training the next generation of military marksmen and held several shooting records herself. The informal competition that followed drew the attention of all 12 students currently attending Margaret's sessions. They watched as two master-level shooters prepared to demonstrate their respective approaches to long-range precision shooting. Major Chen's equipment setup took nearly 15 minutes, involving computerized ballistic calculations, atmospheric readings from multiple electronic instruments, and GPS coordinates for precise range determination. Her rifle represented the pinnacle of modern sniper technology. Margaret's preparation took 3 minutes. She mounted the same vintage scope she had purchased from Peterson, made visual observations of environmental conditions, and performed mental calculations based on experience rather than electronic data. The target stood at 1,800 yards, nearly beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems. Major Chen fired first, her shot striking within 4 inches of the target center, an excellent shot by any standard, demonstrating why she held her current position. Margaret's shot struck within 2 inches of dead center. Major Chen studied the target through binoculars, clearly impressed despite herself. How did you account for the wind shear at that distance without computer calculations? Margaret pointed to visual indicators she had observed, subtle differences in how grass moved at various distances, the way dust particles drifted differently at ground level versus higher elevations, and heat shimmer patterns that revealed atmospheric disturbances. Experience reading natural signs, Margaret explained, plus understanding how this particular rifle behaves in these specific conditions. I've fired thousands of rounds from this position, so I know how bullets drift in different weather patterns. Major Chen fired 4 more shots, each demonstrating her exceptional skill level. But Margaret's shots consistently struck closer to target center, using equipment that military procurement officers had declared obsolete years earlier. After an hour of shooting, Major Chen approached Margaret with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I'd like to discuss incorporating some of your methods into our official training curriculum. Would you be interested in consulting with the military on modernizing our marksmanship programs?" Margaret considered the unexpected offer carefully. For years she had tried to share her knowledge only to face skepticism and dismissal. Now suddenly, the military establishment was asking for her expertise. 3 months later, Margaret found herself standing before a room full of military brass at Fort Benning, Georgia. The invitation had come through official channels, requesting her presence at a conference on advanced marksmanship training methods for modern warfare. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same military establishment that had dismissed her suggestions during her active service was now asking her to address fundamental problems in their current training programs. Colonel James Morrison, the conference organizer, introduced Margaret with obvious discomfort. Reading between the lines of his formal presentation, it was clear that inviting a retired enlisted soldier to lecture commissioned officers represented a significant departure from military protocol. "Mrs. Sullivan brings unique perspectives to long-range marksmanship," Colonel Morrison announced carefully. "Her unconventional methods have produced some interesting results in civilian training environments." Margaret took the podium wearing a simple business suit, carrying only a folder of handwritten notes. The audience consisted of 43 active duty officers, including sniper school instructors, special operations commanders, and training development specialists. "Gentlemen and ladies," Margaret began, "I'm here because your current marksmanship programs are producing technically proficient shooters who can't adapt when their technology fails." The blunt statement sent ripples of surprise through the audience. Military presentations typically began with diplomatic pleasantries and respectful acknowledgments of existing programs. Margaret continued without apology. "You're training soldiers to operate equipment, not to understand marksmanship fundamentals. When their scopes malfunction or their rangefinders fail, they become ineffective because they never learn to shoot without electronic assistance." She opened her folder, revealing statistical data she had compiled from her civilian training sessions. "In the past 3 months, I've worked with 47 active duty soldiers from various units. When stripped of their electronic aids, 63% couldn't hit man-sized targets at distances they normally engage with computer assistance." Colonel Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Several officers in the audience exchanged skeptical glances, clearly questioning the validity of civilian training results. Major Chen, who had become an advocate for Margaret's methods, stood to address the room. "I've personally observed Mrs. Sullivan's techniques and can verify her claims. Her environmental reading methods consistently produce more accurate shots than computer-calculated solutions." The presentation continued for an hour, with Margaret demonstrating fundamental observation techniques using simple props and visual aids. She explained how to read wind patterns, estimate distances, and calculate bullet trajectories using mental mathematics rather than electronic computers. This isn't anti-technology, Margaret clarified in response to obvious skepticism from the audience. Electronic scopes and rangefinders are excellent tools, but they should enhance natural abilities, not replace them. A sniper who can't function without computers becomes useless when equipment fails. Captain Williams, a sniper school instructor, raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, modern battlefield conditions require quick target engagement. We don't have time for lengthy environmental observations during active combat. Margaret smiled slightly. Captain, how long do you think I spent observing conditions before making that 2-mile shot in Afghanistan that eliminated a Taliban commander? The question hung in the air. Everyone in the room had heard about the legendary shot, though few believed the details. 12 seconds, Margaret answered her own question. From target identification to trigger pull, 12 seconds. Because I had already been reading environmental conditions continuously for 3 hours while waiting for the target to appear. She continued. Environmental awareness isn't something you do before shooting. It's something you maintain constantly while in position. By the time you need to take a shot, you already know everything about wind patterns, air density, and atmospheric conditions. The remainder of the conference involved practical demonstrations. Margaret had arranged for the military to provide outdoor shooting facilities where she could show, rather than simply explain her methods. What followed was a repeat of her earlier civilian demonstrations, but on a larger scale. Military instructors using state-of-the-art equipment were consistently outperformed by an elderly woman using vintage gear and environmental observation techniques. The results were undeniable. Margaret's shots were more accurate, more consistent, and required less time for target engagement once environmental conditions had been properly assessed. By the conference's end, the initial skepticism had transformed into genuine interest. Colonel Morrison approached Margaret with a formal request to develop training materials for integration into existing military programs. We'd like to offer you a consulting contract, Colonel Morrison explained. Help us design a supplementary curriculum that teaches environmental observation alongside electronic equipment training. Margaret considered the offer carefully. I have conditions. Name them. First, students must demonstrate proficiency with iron sights and manual calculations before touching electronic equipment. Second, at least 40% of training time must be spent in field conditions, not on controlled ranges. Third, environmental observation gets equal emphasis with equipment operation. Colonel Morrison hesitated. Margaret's conditions would require significant changes to established training protocols and might extend program duration considerably. And fourth, Margaret added, I want to train your instructors first. They need to understand these principles before they can teach them effectively. After extensive discussion with other conference attendees, Colonel Morrison agreed to a trial program. Margaret would spend 6 months at Fort Benning, working directly with sniper school instructors to develop and test new training methods. As Margaret packed her materials after the conference, Major Chen approached with a personal question. Ma'am, why did you agree to help? After years of being dismissed by the military establishment, you could have simply continued your civilian work. Margaret paused in her packing. Because young soldiers are dying in combat situations where these skills could save their lives. Personal satisfaction isn't worth more than their safety. 3 weeks later, Margaret received an unexpected phone call that would test everything she had been advocating. A special operations unit deployed in Eastern Europe was facing an unusual tactical situation that required extreme range precision shooting under challenging conditions. Their electronic equipment was malfunctioning due to electromagnetic interference from enemy jamming systems. Traditional long-range engagement protocols weren't working, and they needed immediate consultation from someone who could provide alternative solutions. The military was asking Margaret to provide real-time combat support for active operations. Her theoretical knowledge was about to face the ultimate practical test in actual warfare conditions. The secure satellite phone call came at 3 a.m. Margaret recognized Major Chen's voice immediately, but the stress in her tone was unmistakable. Margaret, we need your help. There's a situation developing in Eastern Europe. Special operations team is pinned down by enemy artillery. But their counter-battery fire isn't working because electronic jamming is disrupting all their computerized targeting systems. Margaret was already reaching for her clothes. What's the tactical situation? Enemy artillery position is approximately 2 miles from our team's location. Conventional air support can't reach the area due to surface-to-air missile threats. The only solution is precision rifle fire to eliminate the artillery spotters directing enemy fire. And their electronic scopes aren't functioning. Completely dead. The enemy is using some kind of electromagnetic jamming that's frying all electronic systems. Our snipers can't make accurate shots at that distance without computer assistance. Margaret felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same mental state that had carried her through countless combat situations. I'll need to talk directly to the sniper team. Can you establish communication? 30 minutes later, Margaret sat in her kitchen, speaking over encrypted satellite phone to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the lead sniper of a special operations team under fire in a foreign country she couldn't name. Ma'am, we've got 2 enemy artillery pieces directing fire at a convoy of American troops, Rodriguez reported tersely. Range is 3,200 meters. Our electronic equipment is completely non-functional. We need to eliminate the spotters calling in coordinates, but I can't make shots at that distance without computer calculations. Margaret could hear artillery explosions in the background, confirming the urgency of the situation. American soldiers were dying while they spoke. Sergeant, describe your visual observations of the target area. Don't worry about technical measurements. Just tell me what you see. For the next 10 minutes, Margaret walked Rodriguez through environmental assessment techniques she had been teaching to civilian students. She guided him through reading wind patterns using terrain features, estimating atmospheric conditions from visual cues, and calculating bullet trajectories using manual methods. There's a grove of trees about halfway to the target, Rodriguez reported. The tops are moving differently than the grass at ground level. Good. That indicates wind shear at different elevations. Your bullet will experience different wind speeds as it travels toward the target. Can you see any heat shimmer or air disturbances? Rodriguez described seeing wavering air over sun-heated rocks near the enemy position. Margaret used his observations to guide him through atmospheric density calculations that no computer could perform under current jamming conditions. Ma'am, I'm not confident about making this shot. We've only trained with electronic assistance. Margaret's voice remained calm and steady despite the critical situation. Sergeant, you have all the tools you need. Your rifle, your training, and your eyes. Trust what you can observe directly. I'm going to walk you through this step by step. For the next 15 minutes, Margaret provided real-time coaching to a sniper she had never met, operating in a combat zone thousands of miles away. She guided Rodriguez through manual wind calculations, distance estimation techniques, and trajectory adjustments based entirely on visual observation. The wind is shifting the grass in waves, Rodriguez reported, moving from left to right, but the pattern changes about halfway to the target. Perfect. That's a wind gradient. Adjust your aim point 2 minutes of angle to the left to compensate for the average wind effect across the bullet's path. Margaret could hear renewed artillery fire in the background, closer this time. The enemy was adjusting their aim toward the American position. Ma'am, I need to take this shot now. Our guys are getting hammered. I know, Sergeant. You're ready. Control your breathing. Find your natural respiratory pause and trust your calculations. The satellite phone carried the sound of Rodriguez's rifle firing across thousands of miles. Margaret held her breath, waiting for confirmation while imagining the bullet's 2-mile journey through shifting wind patterns and varying atmospheric conditions. Target down, Rodriguez shouted over the phone. Direct hit on the primary spotter. But the celebration was premature. Within seconds, Rodriguez reported that a second artillery spotter had taken over target designation. The enemy fire resumed with deadly accuracy. Second target, same general area but different position, Rodriguez reported. This guy is smarter, keeping mobile. Margaret guided him through rapid target re-engagement procedures, helping him adjust for the new target location, while maintaining his established environmental calculations. The process that normally required several minutes of computer analysis was compressed into seconds of visual assessment and mental mathematics. The second shot was equally successful. With both artillery spotters eliminated, the enemy guns fell silent, unable to accurately direct their fire without forward observers. Outstanding shooting, Sergeant, Margaret said with genuine pride. You just proved that fundamental marksmanship skills are still the foundation of precision shooting. After the immediate crisis passed, Major Chen returned to the phone call. Margaret, what you just accomplished saved American lives using methods that military doctrine had written off as obsolete. Those methods were never obsolete, Margaret replied. They were just forgotten in favor of easier technological solutions. 3 days later, Margaret received official notification that her training program had been fast-tracked for implementation across all military sniper schools. The success in Eastern Europe had convinced even the most skeptical commanders that environmental observation skills needed immediate integration into existing curricula. 6 months later, Margaret stood once again in the Army surplus store where her journey had begun. Peterson greeted her with genuine respect, and Jake now referred customers to her advanced marksmanship courses on a regular basis. The vintage scope that had started everything sat in a place of honor behind the counter, no longer for sale but displayed as a reminder that old tools and skilled hands could still outperform modern technology. Any regrets about not buying the scope sooner? Peterson asked with a smile. Margaret touched the glass case containing the vintage optic. Sometimes the best tools are the ones that force you to become better yourself. A group of young soldiers entered the store, immediately gravitating toward the newest electronic equipment. Margaret watched them with knowing eyes, remembering her own journey from skepticism to understanding. One of the soldiers noticed the vintage scope display and read the attached plaque describing Margaret's achievements. He approached her with obvious curiosity. "Ma'am, are you really the sniper who made that 2-mile shot in combat using manual calculations?" Margaret smiled, recognizing the familiar skepticism in his young eyes. "Would you like to learn how it's done?" The soldier's eyes widened with interest. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." "Good," Margaret replied. "Come to my property this Saturday. Bring a notebook and dress for field conditions. Real marksmanship training doesn't happen in comfortable environments." As the soldiers left to discuss the unexpected invitation, Peterson approached Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never did apologize properly for doubting you all those months ago." Margaret waved off his concern. "No apology necessary. Skepticism is healthy, as long as people remain open to evidence." She looked once more at the vintage scope that had helped change everything. Sometimes the old ways aren't inferior to new methods. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right person to remember why they worked in the first place. Walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had led from mockery to respect. From dismissed expertise to official recognition, the old scope had become a symbol of something larger. The enduring value of fundamental skills in an increasingly technological world. Her phone buzzed with another message from Major Chen. A new class of military instructors was requesting training in environmental observation techniques. The program Margaret had developed was expanding beyond sniper schools to general marksmanship training for all military personnel. Margaret smiled as she climbed into her pickup truck. There was still work to do, more students to teach, and more young soldiers whose lives might depend on understanding that the most sophisticated technology was only as good as the person operating it. The old scope had taught them all a valuable lesson. Sometimes wisdom comes in vintage packages, waiting patiently for someone skilled enough to unlock its potential.